The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Natural resources are often seen as the source of modern prosperity. Historians will sometimes attribute the prosperity of the United States to abundant natural resources, while the ownership of oil, land, coal, and other resources is popularly seen as a source of great and perhaps also unearned wealth. And we also hear repeated stories about how we are in imminent danger of running out of resources. How do economists think about resources? And are they truly natural? It turns out that knowledge may be more important than the physical resources themselves. And knowledge and discovery provide a radically different way to think about natural resources. Joining me on the show today to talk about resources and the limits of growth is Dr. Art Carden, a professor of economics at the Brock School of Business at Samford University, a contributor to Forbes magazine, and also an affiliated scholar with the Independent Institute. Welcome back to EconVersations, Art.
It's great to be here.
Well, we're going to be talking today about natural resources, and I want to start by saying that this is, you're going to draw some from a paper you've written for the Independent Institute. So tell us a little about that.
Right, so the paper, it actually had its origins in a philosophy, politics, and economics class that I taught at Samford, and we were talking about these problems of original appropriation and the issue of leaving enough and as good, or as much and as good in the commons if someone were going to appropriate something out of the commons as a resource. And this conversation we're having in class got me to thinking about, well, how do we even know that something is a resource to begin with? And for something to be a resource requires that we have knowledge of ways in which we can use the objects or ways in which we can use the object to solve people's desires, or to satisfy people's desires, to solve problems and things like that. And the paper is, it appears as a chapter in the Cambridge Handbook of Classical Liberal Thought that was published last year.
Okay.
And I think provides a really interesting jumping off point for thinking about what it means for something to be a resource.
Right, so we all know that there's lots of natural resources and they are important. And the standard way economists talk about this is using something known as a production function.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so first of all, when we think about whether something is a resource or not, like I mentioned, we have to know whether we can use it to satisfy wants or not. The way that the economist Mike Munger has put it, and I know Dr. Munger's been on EconVersations before, the way he's put it is that something is a resource if people will pay you for it. If you have to pay people to haul it away, then it's garbage. But if people will pay you for it, then it's a resource.
Okay.
But we think about resources in this production function approach as being something that firms and entrepreneurs and entire societies even combine with labor and capital goods to produce output. So we think about resources being things like oil or things like coal or things like various raw materials, metals like iron and tungsten and nickel and copper and tin and so on and so forth. And it's just something that we pour into this production function here with capital and labor, and out pops output.
And although in some ways this is a convenient way to think about what's going on, it also hides an awful lot of knowledge. There's a ton of knowledge that's sort of like lurking beneath the surface here, right?
Right, and I think this is an important thing that a lot of people miss when they talk about resources. They talk about natural resources natural resources running out. Again, we have to understand how we take an object. And here, when I talk about an object, I'm thinking about like a molecule of water, H2O, and how do we use that to satisfy some want?
Right.
And it's not obvious that the things that we encounter in nature are in fact actually resources. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, talks about how the fruits of nature belong to everybody, and the land, the earth itself, belongs to everybody. Well, we don't necessarily know what the fruits of nature are. And when we think about literal, actual fruit, it took humankind a long time to figure out the difference between what would kill us and what wouldn't. When we think about other things, like again oil, well, this was just some goo on the ground up until 100 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. But it was a nuisance and not a resource until we figured out what to do with it. and we figured out what to do with it through a process of experimentation, updating, and learning.
And that also involves learning about the final code. So we're using natural resources as sort of like ingredients to produce things, but we have to know that what we're producing has value too, right?
This is a very good point. It's a very good point. Something is a resource if it can be used to produce something valuable. When I say it's a resource if somebody will pay you for it, well, under what conditions will somebody pay you for something? They'll pay you for something if they can use it to produce something that is valuable. People will pay for oil because they can turn it into gasoline and kerosene and stuff like that, for example, I can put in my car and get from Birmingham to Troy. People will pay for diamonds because first they're pretty, but then also because they have industrial uses.
Right.
People will pay for all of these different metals like copper and silver and gold and so on and so forth because they have important industrial uses. Plastic, for example, or oil, for example, is a resource because it can be used to produce gasoline, kerosene, and plastic products, which can in turn be used to produce transportation and toys that people actually value. So things get their value, a resource gets its definition as a resource, and it also gets its value from the final products, the final goods and services that we can use that we can produce out of these things that we now call resources.
And then in Marcus, you hinted at this, but let's expand a little bit more. I mean, yes, people will pay you for resources, but how much they're willing to pay, and the fact that they're willing to pay ends up being a pretty convoluted, or there's several steps here to go from the fact that, yes, I'll pay you for gasoline at the gas station, to knowing like, well, how much would you be willing to pay for oil reserves, right?
Right, and this is all set up, or this all happens via an amazingly and beautifully, I think, complicated market process through a series of competing bids and offers, where people on the demand side of a market might be thinking, okay, well, I can use West Texas Intermediate crude for the following things, and you have a practically incalculable number of potential uses for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. You have as well a practically incalculable number of people making decisions, evaluating, trying to decide, okay, well, what can we use? So what do we need this particular type of plastic for, say, or what do we need this particular grade of gasoline for, or this particular grade of kerosene for? And the price that emerges in the market is the concatenation of a sort of everybody's expectations about what they can do with, again, say a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. On the supply side, people might look and say, well, okay, here's everybody's best estimate of the value of this West Texas Intermediate crude, the value of what they can produce with it. Does that then make it worth my while to go and get the oil out of the ground? Or might I want to do something else with my time?
Yeah. So this is a very complicated process. And another thing that, once we know that something's a natural resource, it's very easy to sort of forget that all this discovery occurred. So, I mean, things aren't always natural resources, have they? Things haven't always been natural resources. So let's use oil, again, as another example, which we generally think of as sort of one of the canonical natural resources. Well, it's entirely possible that oil goes back to just being a nuisance if we come up with something that is better. So let's suppose that I'm sure, I don't know, you've seen Back to the Future. I'm sure that most of the viewers have seen Back to the Future and things like that. If we get Mr. Fusion online and you can run your car, well, okay, it turns out actually in Back to the Future 3 we learned that the car didn't run on the Mr. Fusion, but if we someday have fusion-powered automobiles, then okay, maybe burning fossil fuels becomes a thing of the past, and it goes back to not being a resource anymore. Unless, of course, we can think of other things to do with it, like making asphalt or making plastics or things of that nature. So something being a resource is highly contingent, and it's contingent specifically on our ability to use it to solve problems. And that knowledge that's involved in that ability to use it. And before we have that knowledge, the thing isn't really a resource, right? Right. Yeah, so you have to know. So here I want to be careful about how we think about knowledge. So on one hand, there's sort of scientific knowledge about the very specific processes that are going on and which chemicals are changing into what when you apply this amount of heat or what have you, and you can probably tell it's been a long time since I took high school chemistry. Yeah, so there is something about that whole refining process. Right. Yes.
But we were baking bread. So humans were baking bread for a long time before they knew how bread got baked. People have been playing soccer for a long time before we actually understood the physics of bending it like Beckham, so to speak. So somebody can be a really good bartender without being a good chemist necessarily. But the knowledge that's relevant, again, is going to be the knowledge of how it solves a problem, or rather whether it solves a problem. So if you go to a bar and you order a Manhattan, the bartender just needs to know if you mix this thing with that thing, then it produces something that people are willing to pay for.
Right.
And that then transmits backward value to the ingredients in the Manhattan, which then transmits backward value to whatever, I don't know, actually know how to make a Manhattan, but it goes back to the inputs into the liquors and things like that go into making a Manhattan, that in turn again creates labor, or creates value for the labor and then the raw materials and things like that are ultimately at the very, very beginning of the process.
And again, just highlighting the knowledge here. I mean, we have inventions, both of the
Right.
goods that we invented, like Thomas Edison invented so many things that we make our lives better today. But then also, does he come up with a light bulb, and that has impacts. But then, I think it was a tungsten he was able to use, and how he had to make a vacuum to make the light bulb. I mean, then that gives the tungsten value.
Right.
Like tungsten
Yes.
all of a sudden now becomes a resource that people care about.
Yeah, something becomes a resource when we can figure out some way to use it. And again, I personally don't know a ton about light bulb construction, so I'll take your word for it. But if we
I think it was tungsten, as I recall.
Okay.
At some point in time.
But whatever they make light bulb filaments out of, which this actually, pardon me, this actually illustrates a really, really important point about the sort of wonder of the market process as a knowledge generator. So here we are, kind of hemming and hawing and fumbling about how you make a light bulb, or how a light bulb actually operates. And what's really cool about an innovative market and this overall broad market process is that we are able to harness knowledge we ourselves don't have for purposes that other people may not be able to imagine. So Thomas Edison, when he's inventing the light bulb, or when a firm is manufacturing a light bulb, they're not thinking, man, we need to make studio lights for these guys to sit and talk about economics and sort of blubber about where light bulbs come from. They don't know what our ends are, but yet we are able to take advantage of their knowledge for purposes of producing an economics conversation.
Thank you. Another thing that, one of the elements of resources that are important is having property rights,
Right.
or ownership over the resource.
Yes.
And one of the things that when you own a resource, you have an incentive to do is just to conserve it, right?
Yes. Yes, so property rights provide people with incentives to conserve stuff and incentives to use things wisely. Because when you have a property right in something, you then have a right to everything in the future that thing can produce. So if you own a piece of land, for example, you have a right to every year's crop from that land. And in fact, biblically, when we talk about the year of Jubilee, for example, what people were buying was not, or what people were doing, they weren't buying land, they were buying, say, a certain number of crop years, for example. So when you own the land, or when you own land, if you own a resource, you own everything that comes after it. When you don't own something, then you have weaker incentives to conserve it, weaker incentives to use it well, weaker incentives to use it wisely. If you think about whaling, for example, if you have weak property rights over whales, or if you don't have property rights over whales, they're going to tend to be overexploited. Because if you don't harpoon the whale that you see, then the next boat that comes along is going to harpoon it. And you would then forego any benefit that you could get from killing the whale, selling the blubber, scraping out all of the stuff that goes into various cosmetics and things of that nature that whale oil and whatnot was used for.
Right.
So property rights are essential. Property rights define ownership. Who has a right to exclude other people from, again, use of the land, use of the whale, use of your lawnmower, use of what have you. Okay. And thereby property rights provide people with incentives to use things wisely.
So incentive to use some of your land, maybe to plant trees,
Right.
so that we have plenty of trees in the future for paper.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and so paper is actually a very good example. So people talk about saving trees, for example, by cutting back on their paper usage, and it's kind of ambiguous. It's not really clear that that's what's going on because paper is generally made from trees that are farmed. It's like saying that you're saving corn by not eating as many tortilla chips. Well, okay, I'm not really sure that you're in fact actually saving corn in any meaningful sense.
Right.
So a tree,
in some sense, trees that were planted specifically to be there to generate paper one day. I mean, those trees might well not be planted.
Exactly.
If it wasn't with the need of the need for the market demand for paper.
Right. And if you look, so there's actually a really good image you can find online of what happened to Zimbabwe after land collectivization. It's a very, very bright line, but that shows you, it's a really nice example of almost a perfect experiment. On one side of the line, the land was collectivized. On the other side of the line, the land wasn't. And after collectivization, the collectivized land turns brown, and the non-collectivized land stays green and verdant and productive. So having property rights is essential, I think, to wise resource management and wise environmental stewardship.
When we have property rights and then we end up having markets for some of these natural resources, that ends up actually being able to extend this knowledge, the use of knowledge. So here's an example of a rubber plantation. Like once you have a market for rubber, then that expands our ability to across society to use rubber, right?
Right. So yeah, so a market for rubber and a larger market for rubber makes, it gives more people opportunities to use rubber. And we say, what do you mean by use rubber? Well, rubber is a resource because we know that we can use it to solve problems specifically. And furthermore, we're able to use the specialized and specific knowledge of people we may not know, people who may not like us that much if we met them, people who have values that differ from ours, people who may not pray the same way and things like that. They have all of this specialized knowledge about how to harvest rubber or how to harness rubber that we don't have, but that we are nonetheless able to use. And that's one of the really, really neat things about a market economy, is all of that information gets collapsed into prices. And by following these price signals, we're able to make wise or wiser choices about how we use things like rubber trees.
And the person who's running the rubber plantation doesn't have to know all the different uses that rubber might be put to, right?
Right. So the iPad actually presents a really good example of this. So when Apple introduced the iPad, everybody was asking, "Okay, what is it for? What is it for? What are people going to do with this thing?" And it wasn't until people had experimented with a little bit and found all the different ways they could use an iPad that we came to understand, okay, oh, here's how this thing was actually useful. We can compare and contrast that to something like the Microsoft Zune. We knew, okay, what we were going to use it for. Well, we were going to use it to play music. Well, it turns out actually that didn't work so well, and it ended up being an entrepreneurial failure on Microsoft's part. So on one hand, you had the iPad, where we didn't really know what we're going to use it for, that was a success. On the other hand, you had the Microsoft Zune, where we had a pretty good idea of what we're going to use it for, that ended up being a failure.
Now, we look at natural resources, and again, we might think that whoever owns a natural resource can get rich from owning it, but they're also, in almost all cases, doing a lot of production to actually get us those resources in a usable fashion in the form that we're going to want them, right?
Right. So there are a couple of things that go on here. First, returns on natural resources are relatively small as a percentage of the world's output. So, or a percentage even of the United States output. So the returns that go in the form of rent to resource-bearing land. So things like paying for oil rights and whatnot. It's an enormous amount of money relative to what's in my checkbook or relative to what's in my checking account right now, but it's really not that much compared to U.S. gross domestic product. So the value of natural resources is actually surprisingly small as a fraction of overall output, or the income to natural resources is small as a fraction of overall income. Second, a lot of this stuff has been around for a really long time. Oil, coal, all of the different metals that today we think of as being important natural resources, a lot of this we didn't really figure out how to use, we didn't figure out how to make the most of until just a couple of centuries ago. We've been using various metals for a really, really long time, but it's only been in the last several centuries, again, that we've been using coal, that we've been using oil, that we've been using a lot of these other resources to actually produce stuff. Okay. There's another important point, I think, about how we think about the income that's generated by land and natural resources, and that concerns the fact that deciding how to use an oil field, or how to use a field that might have oil in it, is itself an act of entrepreneurial judgment. So the income that is accruing to the owners of natural resources may not be, well, part of it is a return to the resource per se, perhaps, but more of it too is accruing to the generation of this knowledge via an act of entrepreneurial judgment.
So popularly, we do think of, like, oil, ownership of oil as a way to get rich. It shows up on TV and all throughout our culture, but actually the statistics show it's not that important, is that? Right.
Yeah, it matters because we use oil for a lot of things, but the amount of income that's generated by oil per se is still relatively small.
And even natural resources as a group.
Yeah, even natural resources as a group, again, still relatively small.
Labor gets a lot more of our national income than natural resources, right?
Yeah, far and away. By far, labor gets a much larger share of national income.
Well, one of the things you often hear is that we're going to run out of resources, that we're in danger of running out of resources. And again, that's really thinking, I think that's in part because we're thinking of the resources that are driving prosperity as the physical things as opposed to the knowledge. But we're going to run out of resources, and yet it hasn't really happened. I mean, for instance, back in the day, we first started drilling for oil in western Pennsylvania. And when western Pennsylvania and Ohio oil fields were nearing exhaustion, we thought, oh, we face a oil shortage. We're about to run out of oil. Well, it didn't happen, right?
Right, because increasing scarcity, or say reductions in supply relative to demand, will put upward pressure on price. And that price sends a really important signal to everybody in the market. It says either, one, find more of whatever it is you're talking about, in this case oil, or two, use something else. And it's those price signals that then drive discovery and substitution.
And so, I mean, people started looking at other parts of the country for oil because they knew that it had value and had a market. And lo and behold, there was oil in Texas. Who knew that?
Absolutely.
And of course, we know it now, but we didn't know it then, right?
Right.
And then we also see other examples because we started drilling for oil and refining oil because we were facing another I guess, energy shortage prior to that, right?
Yeah, so whale oil is an example of something that everybody was concerned that we were going to run out of. And establishing property rights in whales is it's a difficult technological problem, as far as I understand. But scarcity or rising prices of whale oil help to induce search for, first of all, more whale oil, but then second of all, for substitutes. And the substitutes that we found included, again, petroleum distillates and petroleum derivatives that substantially reduced our need, put need in quotation marks, to go out and kill whales for oil and blubber and things of that nature. Okay. There's an interesting parenthetical point here with respect to how the resources get used, and that concerns the quality of the jobs that are now available. Some jobs got destroyed, but in his book Suicide of the West, Jonah Goldberg writes about how it's probably working on an oil field is probably difficult, but it's probably better than scraping the inside of a dead whale cranium. So, which is what was being done to get products from sperm whales and whatnot in the 19th century.
Well, yeah, it's probably not a job you'd want to have there.
No, it isn't. I'd much rather be an economist.
Now, when we think about resources, not as much as in the physical terms as in the knowledge that's behind them, that gives us a very different way of thinking about resources, and it brings us to a very important economist work in this area, Julian Simon. So tell us a little bit about this.
So Julian Simon is one of my intellectual heroes. In fact, our younger son actually had his birthday yesterday, and his middle name is Simon, named after Julian Simon. Okay. Because one of the major points that Simon made is that the ultimate resource is the human mind. And to the extent that we can come up with creative new ways to tell stories, or creative new ways to use what we think of as resources, or creative new ways to invent products, economic progress is effectively unbounded. Okay? Because its only limitation, in some sense, is the human imagination. And if the human imagination is unlimited, that means therefore that economic progress, the future of economic progress, is unlimited. Now, a lot of people didn't think this was the case, and people prophesied that. Well, Paul Ehrlich, for example, at Samford University, was a proponent of the thesis that the battle to feed humanity is over, that mass starvation is right around the corner, and that we're going to run out of pardon me, we're going to run out of natural resources. He made a famous bet with Julian Simon, where they said, let's bet on the future prices of 5 commodities: copper, chromium, nickel, tungsten, and tin. And if the prices have gone up, that supports Ehrlich's thesis, and Julian Simon will pay Ehrlich the difference. If the price has gone down, that supports Simon's thesis about the mine being the ultimate resource, and Paul Ehrlich will pay Julian Simon. And when the bet was settled, real resource prices had fallen by almost 60%, and Ehrlich ended up writing a check to Julian Simon for, I believe it was $576.09.
And this is a really fundamental way, in one which I think even many economists don't fully grasp this this whole idea of the knowledge that's behind resources, right?
Right. Yeah. Again, it's a fundamental importance to think that what gives an object value is not its chemical properties or its position in time and space or what have you, but rather our recognition of the connection between the use of that object and the satisfaction of certain wants. So for example, in this bottle of water, what makes this valuable, what makes this a resource, is not the fact that it's comprised of, that each molecule is comprised of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. It's the fact that by drinking water, I can satisfy a want, which is slaking my thirst.
And I think Simon's work is also important to realize why the historians or those who want to say like, oh, the United States was so prosperous because we had such abundant natural resources. I mean, that ultimately wasn't the important thing. It was the knowledge, and then probably also the economic freedom that allowed people to develop the knowledge and apply the knowledge, right?
Yeah, if resources were the reason why people in some places are very rich and other places are very poor, this would have happened a long time ago. I don't know how long it takes for organic matter to turn into petroleum or to turn into oil, but it takes a lot longer than the several thousand years that have passed since the Neolithic Revolution, and the oil's been there for pretty much the entirety of the history of the human species. If it were resources per se, then we would have gotten a lot richer a lot longer ago. And moreover, we wouldn't have places like Hong Kong and Singapore that are relatively resource poor, but that nonetheless have very high incomes today.
And the key to developing that knowledge and really that sort of applied knowledge, both of what satisfies human wants, or the things that we want, and then how we can make them using different things that exist out there in the world, is probably that freedom. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the right to say, I'm going to try a thing, and if the thing doesn't work, then I'm on the hook for losing money. If the thing does work, then maybe I make some money doing it. And affording people the right to do that is a big part of what explains why we today have the standards of living that we enjoy.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the show and talk about
Thank
this.
you.
I think it was very enlightening and very helpful. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
All right.